about the accession process. Something we've heard a great deal about already, actually, because of Ukraine's desire to join the EU. So it's very much an issue on the table at the moment. Now, as with all things European, there is a treaty provision. It's not Article 50, which was a provision that took us out of the EU. It's Article 49, which is the provision that takes states into the European Union. And I just want to dwell on a couple of points. First, as you can see from Article 49, any European state which respects the values referred to in Article 2, and those include, obviously, equality, rule of law, and respect for human rights, an issue, of course, for the UK if it decides to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights, and is committed to promoting them, may apply to become a member. And then there is a process which is laid down. I'll say something about that in a moment, but note it requires the unanimous agreement of all of the existing member states voting in council, and the conditions of admission and the adjustments of the treaty shall be the subject of an accession agreement, which will need to be ratified by all contracting states in accordance with their respective constitutional requirements. And that brings us back to the Walloons. And you remember that when we were discussing all of this in what might seem like a long time ago about would the Trade and Cooperation Agreement need agreement from all of the member states, including the good folk in Wallonia. Each member state has got the opportunity to vote on any deal. So that the treaty provisions have been supplemented by what are known as the Copenhagen criteria. 3 Copenhagen criteria requires, first of all, the political criteria, so stability of institutions, economic criteria, functioning market economy, and administrative and institutional capacity to effectively implement the acquis. Now, all of this, of course, the UK would probably satisfy, at least formally, not least because, of course, it is still a relatively short time since the UK left. But it is worth noting that the Commission on its own website has added a couple of other things that are taken into account, not least the Union's capacity to absorb new members. That's an issue about Ukraine because, of course, there are many dimensions of the Ukraine accession. But also, you know, would the Union want a state like the UK back? As far as process, look, process turns most people off, so I will do it very briefly. But as you can see, a state can apply if it thinks it meets the accession criteria. It can then be given candidate country status. Now, in fact, candidate country status is not necessarily a great place to be. In fact, a number of countries have had candidate status for a very long time. Turkey's had candidate status since 1999. Albania had candidate status in 2014, having requested membership in 2009. Finally, accession negotiations opened for Albania in 2020. All I'm saying is the risk is that just because you've been given candidate country status doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be fast-tracked into membership. Then there are the negotiating mandate given to the Commission to do the hard work. And once the Commission has done the hard work, and more importantly, so has the member state, then eventually the Commission can recommend membership, and that requires unanimity in Council, so all existing member states have agreed. Now, the box marked negotiations effectively refers to these chapters, and essentially for a new member state, they have to sign up to all of the legislation across all of these fields before a state can join. Now, again, this is the difference between Ukraine, which very much wants to join, and the UK, were the UK to decide to join, because at the moment, prior to the retained EU law bill, there is still quite significant alignment between UK law and EU law. Now, the retained EU law bill if it does indeed sunset large swathes of the 4,000 or so pieces of retained EU law, will of course be significantly divergent from the EU acquis, so it would take longer to come back in. Final question is, how long can accession negotiations take? The answer is it can be very long indeed. Now, actually, when we acceded the first time round, as you can see from the top of this bar chart, it took 2 and a bit years. Now, it depends how you count, of course. As you know, we applied to join originally in the 1960s, but the formal process took 2 and a bit years, whereas for the Croatian accession, it took the best part of 8 years. The average period is 4 years, 10 months. Now, all of this, I realise, is superficial because, of course, it doesn't address the fundamental question that Anand and Hussein have both addressed already. Is there a desire on the part of any UK political party to go through this process? And is there a desire on the part of the EU to have the UK back? And basically the answer to both those questions seems to be no. So you could say this is a somewhat futile discussion, and I've just wasted the last 5 to 6 minutes of your time. The only thing I would say is it is worth watching what's going on with Ukraine at the moment, because obviously the situation, the difference between the Ukraine and the UK is vast. I don't need to spell that out to this audience. But Ukraine is desperate to join the EU and wants some fast-track process, 2 years worth of process, and it can be in. And of course, Ukraine, for very obvious reasons, is in a dire financial situation at the moment. And there are also serious issues about corruption in Ukraine, although I understand that Ukraine, in its absolute overwhelming desire to join the EU, is really trying to tackle the corruption issue. But what is interesting is that there is some talk now about allowing the Ukraine to join in parts. In other words, instead of having to go through all of these chapters, all of these areas, and only when every single chapter has been signed off can Ukraine join, there is some experimentation about looking to see whether it might be possible to allow Ukraine to, for example, join the telecoms part of the European Union. Now, we have heard endlessly about the fact that the single market is indivisible. And yet, what we've seen from the Windsor Agreement and indeed the original Northern Ireland Protocol, that of course this mantra of the indivisibility of the single market is in fact not actually respected on the grounds in Northern Ireland, where of course in respect to Northern Ireland Protocol, Northern Ireland is part of the customs union of the European Union and the single market for goods. But it is interesting that now with Ukraine, for a variety of reasons, the EU is beginning to look at the possibility of just allowing, dare I say it, cherry picking. Thank you very much.